The sound of her laughter cut through the party chatter like a knife, sharp, mocking, deliberate. My daughter-in-law Amber stood in a circle of her friends, mimicking my sister-in-law Margaret's Midwestern accent and the way she always touches people's arms when she talks. And then she says, "Now, honey, when are you two giving me some grandbabies?" Amber's impression was cruel, exaggerated. The women around her giggled behind champagne flutes, their eyes occasionally darting toward Margaret, who thankfully was across the room, oblivious. I felt my chest tighten as I stood frozen by the dessert table, fork suspended over my untouched cheesecake. God, these old ladies need to mind their own business. Amber continued, rolling her eyes, like, "Sorry your life is over, but I've got plans that don't include popping out kids just so you can have someone to knit booties for." My son Jason wasn't there to hear any of this. He was at the bar, ordering another round for his friends. I might have let it go. I've learned to swallow a lot of things in my 62 years. But then I heard Amber say something that made my blood run cold. At least we're getting a free party out of the old bag. She thinks her precious son tells her everything. She has no idea we're using her money for the down payment on the condo too. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Jason had told me they'd saved for that down payment themselves, that the $42,500 I'd given them for the anniversary party was strictly for tonight's celebration, the one Margaret and I had spent months helping plan, down to the handwritten place cards and Margaret's homemade centerpieces. I steadied myself against the table, feeling the starched linen beneath my fingers, and that's when Amber spotted me. Our eyes locked. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she tilted her chin defiantly, daring me to make a scene. What happened next still plays in my mind like a movie. I set my plate down carefully, smoothed my navy blue dress, the one I'd spent too much on because Jason said he wanted me to look nice for once, and walked toward the small stage where the jazz quartet had been playing. Every step felt like moving through molasses. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, drowning out the chatter and laughter. The weight of my checkbook in my clutch suddenly felt like a brick. I had planned to give them one final check tonight, an additional $15,000 as a surprise anniversary gift. Instead, I took the microphone from its stand. My hand didn't even tremble. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I'd like to make a toast to my son and daughter-in-law on their 5th anniversary." The room quieted. Jason appeared at the edge of the crowd, a questioning look on his face. Amber's smile was frozen in place. "I want to thank you all for coming to this beautiful celebration," I continued. "A celebration that cost exactly $42,500, every penny of which came from my retirement savings." I looked directly at Amber, and apparently, that's not all I've been contributing to. I met Jason when he was just 22 years old, fresh out of college, and still wearing those awful wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a young Harry Potter. My late husband Frank had just passed away 6 months earlier from a heart attack that took him in his sleep, and the insurance company where Jason started working assigned him to help me sort through Frank's policies. Back then, I was just Margaret's sister-in-law, not yet the mother figure Jason would later come to rely on. He was meticulous, patient, explaining everything twice when he needed to. "Mrs. Reynolds," he'd say, "I know this is overwhelming, but we'll take it one page at a time." I remember thinking he was the kind of son I wished I'd had. Frank and I had tried for years, but it never happened for us. And eventually we built a life that was full in other ways. Jason started coming by every other week, even after the paperwork was settled. He'd bring coffee and ask if I needed help with anything around the house. At first I thought it was just professional courtesy. But then one day he confessed, "My mom died when I was in high school. Cancer. You remind me of her sometimes, the way you arrange your teacups. Always handled out." I didn't know what to say, so I just offered him more coffee and a slice of the lemon pound cake I'd baked that morning. "My dad remarried pretty quick after," he continued, staring into his mug. "His new wife didn't really want me around. I moved out at 18 and haven't been back much. Something shifted between us that day. I started inviting him for Sunday dinners. He started calling me Aunt Eleanor, though we had no blood relation. When he helped me put up Christmas lights that December, climbing the ladder I wasn't supposed to use anymore, I realized we'd built something meaningful, a bridge across generations, across loss. Margaret noticed it too. "You've adopted a stray," she teased over our weekly phone calls. "Frank would be pleased. He always said you had too much love to keep to yourself. And she was right. Frank had been gone 2 years when Jason asked if he could bring someone to Sunday dinner. Her name is Amber, he said, his face flushed with that special kind of excitement only new love brings. She's amazing, Aunt Eleanor. I think she might be the one. I remember feeling a pang of something, not quite worry, not quite jealousy, but I pushed it aside. Of course, I told him. I'll make pot roast. I spent all day cleaning, polishing the good silverware, setting out the china plates with the forget-me-not pattern that had been a wedding gift from my mother. I wanted everything to be perfect for this woman who had captured Jason's heart. When they arrived that evening, I knew instantly why Jason was smitten. Amber was stunning, tall, willowy, with long blonde hair and bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She brought an expensive bottle of wine and complimented my home immediately. This place has such character, she said, running her fingers along the walnut banister. So much more personality than those cookie-cutter condos everyone's obsessed with. She helped me in the kitchen, asking questions about the recipes, seeming genuinely interested in the stories behind them. My grandmother used to make bread like this, she said, breaking apart a dinner roll, before she had to move into that awful nursing home. I found myself warming to her quickly, especially seeing how she looked at Jason like he hung the moon and stars just for her. It wasn't until after dinner, when Jason went to the cellar to find another bottle of wine, that I caught a glimpse of something else. Amber's phone buzzed and her expression changed as she read the message, hardened somehow. She typed rapidly, muttering under her breath, "No, I haven't asked her yet. Give me time." When she noticed me watching, she flashed that dazzling smile again. "Just work," she explained, slipping the phone into her pocket. "They never respect weekends anymore." I nodded, but something felt off, a single false note in an otherwise perfect symphony. Still, I dismissed it. Everyone's entitled to a moment of irritation, especially when work intrudes on personal time. But later that night, after they'd left, I found myself wondering about that text as I washed the dishes. Who was she supposed to ask about what? The question nagged at me as I carefully dried my mother's china. I'll tell you exactly how many times Amber came to Sunday dinner before she and Jason got engaged, because I kept track in my little blue journal. 17 Sundays of pot roasts and apple pies, and stories about my life with Frank. 17 opportunities to see what I somehow missed. The engagement happened quickly, just 6 months after I met her. Jason brought Amber to the house on a Tuesday evening, unusual for their routine, both of them practically vibrating with excitement. "Aunt Eleanor," Jason said, his voice catching. "We have news." Amber thrust out her left hand, where a diamond the size of a small marble caught the light from my reading lamp. "We're getting married," they announced in unison. I hugged them both, of course, told them how happy I was, asked all the right questions about dates and venues. But even as I moved through the motions, something felt wrong. The ring was ostentatious, nothing like the classic styles Jason had always admired, and it looked expensive, far more expensive than what an entry-level insurance adjuster should be able to afford. "It's gorgeous," I said, holding Amber's hand to examine the ring. "It must have cost a fortune." A shadow crossed Jason's face, so quickly I almost missed it. "I've been saving," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Amber squeezed his arm possessively. "Jason wanted me to have the best," she said. "Isn't that right, babe?" He nodded, smiling at her with such naked adoration that my concerns seemed petty by comparison. Who was I to question their happiness? Besides, maybe he had been saving diligently. Maybe he got a bonus I didn't know about. Later, as I served them coffee and the apple tart I'd made that morning, Amber casually mentioned wedding venues. "We're thinking the Bellevue," she said. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. The Bellevue was the most exclusive hotel in the city, where basic wedding packages started at $50,000. "That's ambitious," I managed. Jason stared at his plate. "Actually, Aunt Eleanor," he said slowly, "I was hoping to talk to you about that, about alone." Their wedding was exactly 11 months after that evening, on a perfect June day at the Bellevue Hotel. I contributed $35,000, nearly a third of what remained of Frank's life insurance, telling myself it was what he would have wanted. "Consider it my gift to you both," I said, when Jason tried to insist it was just a loan. Frank and I never had children to spend it on. The wedding was beautiful, I have to admit. Amber was radiant in a designer gown that cost more than my first car. Jason looked handsome and nervous in his tuxedo. Margaret sat beside me during the ceremony, squeezing my hand when my eyes welled up. "You've been so generous with them," she whispered. "Frank would be proud." I nodded, blinking back tears. But even then, something felt off. During the reception, I overheard Amber talking to a friend near the ladies' room. The old lady came through. She was saying, her words slightly slurred from champagne, "Jason said she wouldn't, but I told him nobody says no to a wedding." I froze, lipstick in hand, listening through the partially open door. "How much?" her friend asked. Amber laughed. "Enough for the wedding and then some. We're thinking of buying that condo now instead of waiting." The next morning, I told myself I'd misheard or misunderstood, that the champagne had affected my hearing, or that Amber had been talking about someone else. I pushed the memory away and focused instead on building a relationship with my new daughter-in-law. I invited them to Sunday dinners, sent thoughtful gifts on birthdays and holidays, offered to help them find a starter home when they mentioned moving out of their apartment. For nearly a year, things seemed fine. Jason was promoted at work. Amber got a job at a PR firm. Though she never seemed to work consistent hours, they came to dinner most Sundays, and Amber would help in the kitchen, asking about recipes, commenting on my decor. "This china is gorgeous," she'd say, holding up one of my mother's plates. "Probably worth a fortune now, being vintage and all." Or, "Your wedding ring is so classic. Do you ever think of updating the setting?" It wasn't until they started house hunting that I noticed a shift. Suddenly, the homes they were considering were well beyond what I knew they could afford on their salaries. "We've been saving," Jason would say when I carefully inquired. But then I'd see Amber's new designer purse, or hear about their weekend getaway to Napa. Things weren't adding up. Then came the phone call that should have been my wake-up call. It was a Tuesday afternoon, almost exactly 2 years after they married. I was in my garden, pruning roses, when my cell phone rang. It was Jason, his voice tight with stress. "Aunt Eleanor, I hate to ask, but we're in a bit of a bind. The down payment for the condo is due Friday, and our funds are temporarily tied up. Could we possibly borrow $25,000 just for a month or two until our investment matures?" I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. What investment? Jason had never mentioned investing money before, but his voice sounded so desperate, so unlike the confident young man I knew. "Of course," I heard myself say. "I'll transfer it first thing tomorrow." The relief in his sigh was palpable. "You're a lifesaver," he said. "Literally, the best. I promise we'll pay you back with interest." That was 3 years ago. The temporary loan was never repaid. Instead, there were more requests, always urgent, always temporary. $8,000 for unexpected condo association fees. $12,500 when Amber lost her job, though I later discovered she'd actually quit to find something more fulfilling. $3,300 for emergency car repairs. Each time, Jason promised repayment. Each time, the subject was somehow avoided during subsequent visits. I started keeping track in a small red notebook I kept in my desk drawer at its amounts, the reasons given. By their 5th anniversary, the total had reached $86,300, not counting the wedding contribution. I never mentioned the mounting debt to Margaret. I was too embarrassed, too afraid she'd think I was being taken advantage of. Maybe I was in denial myself. After all, Jason still called me every few days, still treated me with the same affection. He always had. It was easier to pretend everything was fine than to confront the growing evidence that it wasn't. One Sunday, about 6 months before the anniversary party, I accidentally opened a credit card statement addressed to Jason that had been delivered to my house. They still used my address for some of their mail, claiming the condo's mailbox was unreliable. What I saw made my hands shake. A balance of over $42,000, with minimum monthly payments of $960. Purchases at luxury retailers, high-end restaurants, weekend getaways to places I'd never been. I quickly resealed the envelope, feeling like I'd violated his privacy, yet sick with the realization of where my loans had likely gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, the red notebook open before me, calculating how much of my savings remained. The answer was disturbing. Barely enough to sustain me for another 5 years if my health held out. Frank had been meticulous about providing for me, but our plans had never accounted for supporting another household. The turning point came 3 months before their anniversary, when Jason called with his biggest request yet. "Aunt Eleanor," he said, his voice that familiar mix of excitement and hesitation that I'd come to recognize as the prelude to asking for money. "Amber and I were thinking of throwing a party for our 5th anniversary. Nothing huge, just close friends and family." I waited, already knowing what was coming. "The thing is, with the market being what it is, we're a little cash poor right now. We were wondering if you might be willing to help out. Just this once." I closed my eyes, phone pressed to my ear. "How much, Jason?" The pause before he answered told me everything. "Around 40,000. The venue Amber has her heart set on is pretty exclusive, but it would mean so much to her, to us. $40,000. More than some people make in a year, for one night's celebration." I should have said no. I should have finally drawn the line. Instead, I heard myself ask, "When do you need it by?" His relief was audible. "You're the best, Aunt Eleanor. Seriously, this is the last time. I promise. Things are about to turn around for us." I transferred the money the next day, $42,500, to cover the party and what Jason called unexpected expenses. It left my account with a balance of just $67,432.21, that remained of my retirement, my security, my future. After I sent the money, things changed. Jason's calls became less frequent. Sunday dinners were often canceled at the last minute. When they did come over, Amber spent most of the time on her phone, barely engaging in conversation. "Work is just crazy right now," she'd say with a dismissive wave. "This client is so demanding," but I'd catch glimpses of her screen Instagram, not email. Shopping sites, not work documents. I started noticing other things too. How Jason would flinch slightly when Amber used a certain tone, how he'd check with her before answering even simple questions like whether he wanted more potatoes, how his once confident posture had gradually slouched into something more hesitant, more uncertain. Once, when Amber went to the bathroom, I gently asked, "Is everything okay, Jason? With you too?" The flash of panic in his eyes alarmed me. "Of course," he said too quickly. "Everything's great. Amber's just under a lot of pressure. That's all." The party planning consumed the next 3 months. Amber insisted that Margaret and I help with the details, though she rejected most of our suggestions. "No offense," she'd say, "but we're going for elegant, not vintage." She'd dismissed Margaret's handmade decoration ideas with barely concealed disdain. "That's sweet, but maybe for a different kind of event." I watched my sister-in-law's face fall time after time, yet she kept showing up, kept offering to help. "She's young," Margaret would say when we were alone. "She doesn't understand the value of handmade things yet." But I was beginning to understand exactly what Amber valued. And it wasn't anything you couldn't put a price tag on. I'll never forget the day we went to taste cakes. The bakery had prepared 6 different samples, each more elaborate than the last. When the baker stepped away, Amber leaned across the table. "I already know which one we're getting," she whispered. "The champagne with gold leaf. I just wanted to see what a 6-tier cake would cost on the old lady's dime." She didn't realize I was standing just around the corner, having stepped away to take a call. I felt physically ill, my hands clammy as I gripped my phone. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" the baker asked, noticing my pallor when I returned. "Just a little warm in here," I lied. But the truth was, something cold had settled in my chest, the realization that I'd been nothing but a checkbook to Amber all along, and possibly to Jason too. 2 weeks before the party, I decided I needed to know exactly what I was paying for. I told Jason and Amber I wanted to see the venue, to help with last-minute preparations. Amber seemed annoyed but couldn't find a reasonable excuse to refuse. The 3 of us met the event coordinator, a crisp, efficient woman named Valerie, at the Meridiana renovated historic building downtown that charged a premium for its timeless elegance. As Valerie walked us through the space, discussing the timeline for the evening, I carefully asked questions. "And the final payment has been processed?" Valerie checked her tablet. "Yes, the $28,750 was received last month." I kept my expression neutral, even as my mind raced. The venue cost $28,750, not $42,500. Where had the rest of my money gone? Amber quickly steered the conversation to the menu, but I wasn't finished. And that includes the catering, correct? Valerie looked confused. No, the catering is separate. That was $6,300 for 75 guests. I did the mental math. Even adding the bar service Valerie mentioned, $3,200. We were still missing over $4,000. Not to mention that Jason had told me they were inviting just close friends and family, maybe 30 people total. On the drive home, I sat silently in the back seat while Amber chattered about flower arrangements. Jason kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, a worried crease between his eyebrows. Later that night, he called. Is everything okay, Aunt Eleanor? You seemed quiet today. I took a deep breath. Jason, I'm confused about something. The venue coordinator said the total for everything was about $38,250. What happened to the rest of the money I sent? The silence that followed was deafening. Oh, he finally said, his voice small. There were other expenses. Amber's dress, the photographer, party favors. Even as he listed items, I could hear the lie in his voice. Jason, I said quietly, please don't lie to me. Not you. He started to respond. Then I heard Amber's voice in the background. Who are you talking to? The line went dead moments later. He didn't call back that night, or the next day. When he finally did call, 3 days later, he acted as if our conversation had never happened. Amber wants to know if you think we should have the jazz quartet played during dinner or just cocktail hour, he said, his voice falsely bright. I answered his question and didn't press the issue of the money. But something had shifted irreversibly between us. I began to see clearly what I'd been trying so hard not to, that the sweet boy who had helped me through my grief had somehow become a man I barely recognized. The week before the party, I had lunch with Margaret at our favorite cafe downtown. I hadn't planned to tell her everything, but somehow, over chicken salad and iced tea, it all came pouring out: the loans, the credit card statement, the missing money, my dwindling savings. By the time I finished, my tea was cold and Margaret was gripping my hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Eleanor, she said, her voice gentle but firm, this has to stop. They're taking advantage of you. Frank would be heartbroken. Tears blurred my vision. I know, I whispered. But Jason was there for me when I lost Frank. He's like the son we never had. I can't just abandon him. Margaret shook her head. You're not abandoning him. You're refusing to be his personal ATM. There's a difference. She pulled a business card from her purse and slid it across the table. My friend's son is a financial advisor. He specializes in helping seniors protect their assets. Talk to him before you give them another penny. I met with David Goldstein the next day. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, but his eyes were kind and he didn't talk down to me like some young professionals do with older clients. Mrs. Reynolds, he said after reviewing the numbers I'd brought, I'm going to be very direct with you. If you continue at this rate, you'll be completely out of savings within 2 years. What's your plan after that? The question hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't allowed myself to think that far ahead. I don't know, I admitted. I guess I assumed Jason would start paying me back eventually. David's expression was sympathetic but serious. Based on what you've told me, that seems unlikely. People who've borrowed this much without repayment typically don't suddenly change their behavior. He leaned forward, his voice gentle. Mrs. Reynolds, have you considered that your son-in-law and his wife might be taking advantage of your generosity? I felt a flash of defensiveness. Jason's not like that. He's a good boy. Even as I said it, I knew I was describing the Jason of the past, not the man he'd become. David nodded. I believe you care about him deeply, but sometimes the people we love can make bad choices, especially when influenced by others. He outlined a plan to protect my remaining assets, including setting up a trust that would make it harder for me to impulsively transfer large sums. And about this anniversary party, he added, I strongly recommend that be your final contribution. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and Frank's photograph. What would you do? I asked his smiling image. Frank had always been the practical one, the voice of reason to balance my soft heart. I could almost hear his response. Ellie, you can't set yourself on fire to keep others warm. I made my decision then. I would go to the anniversary party. I would be gracious and loving. But it would be the last time I opened my checkbook for them. The relief that washed over me with that decision was immediate and profound. like setting down a heavy burden I'd been carrying for years. I called David the next morning and told him to proceed with the trust. It's the right choice, Mrs. Reynolds, he assured me. For all of you. I also made one other decision that night. Staring at Frank's photograph, I would write a check for $15,000 as a final gift at the party. One last gesture of love before I closed that particular door. A clean break, with no regrets or resentments to follow me. The night of the party arrived, unseasonably warm, for early September. I wore the navy blue dress I'd bought months earlier, paired with the pearl necklace Frank had given me on our 25th anniversary. Margaret picked me up at 6, looking elegant in a silver cocktail dress. "You've got the check?" she asked as we drove downtown. I patted my clutch. "Right here, 15,000 reasons to finally say goodbye to all this." Margaret squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you, Ellie. This isn't easy, but it's necessary." When we arrived at the Meridian, I had to admit, Amber had done a beautiful job with the decorations. Thousands of tiny lights transformed the historic space into something magical. Crystal vases held arrangements of white roses and blue hydrangeas. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner. It was exactly the kind of elegant celebration Frank and I had for our anniversary, years ago. The memory made my heart ache. Jason greeted us at the door, handsome in his dark suit. "Aunt Eleanor, Aunt Margaret," he kissed us both on the cheek. "You both look amazing. Thank you for everything you've done to make tonight happen." There was genuine warmth in his voice, a flash of the old Jason. I hugged him tightly, breathing in his familiar scent. "Where's Amber?" I asked, releasing him. "Finishing up with her makeup, she'll be down soon." We moved into the main room, where about 40 guests were already mingling. I recognized few of them, mostly Amber's friends and colleagues. I assumed Jason introduced us to several couples, always mentioning, "This is my Aunt Eleanor, who helped make tonight possible." Each time, I smiled and accepted their thanks, the weight of my checkbook growing heavier in my clutch. I wondered if any of them knew exactly how possible I'd made it, if Jason and Amber had shared the extent of my financial contributions with their friends. Somehow, I doubted it. When Amber finally made her entrance, she was undeniably stunning, in a form-fitting silver gown that looked even more expensive than her wedding dress. She worked the room like a politician, laughing and touching arms, posing for photos. She greeted Margaret and me with air kisses. "Don't you both look nice?" she said, her eyes barely lingering on us before scanning the room for more important guests. "Help yourselves to champagne." "The good stuff," Jason insisted. She was gone before we could respond, floating toward a group of young women by the bar. Margaret and I found a table near the dessert station, where we could observe without being in the way. 14 crystal vases, at least $200 each, Margaret murmured. "Custom place cards. That dress probably cost more than my car payment." I didn't respond. I was watching Jason across the room, the way he followed Amber with his eyes, constantly checking to make sure she was happy, satisfied, approving. I recognized that look. It was how I'd gazed at Frank in our early years, before we'd built the solid foundation of mutual respect that defined our marriage. The difference was, Frank had always looked back at me the same way. It was about an hour into the party when I overheard Amber with her friends. I'd gone to get a slice of cheesecake, needing a moment away from the increasingly loud music and conversation. That's when I heard her voice, slightly raised with the confidence of someone who doesn't believe they'll be overheard. Or perhaps doesn't care. She was mimicking Margaret, exaggerating her slight Midwestern accent, mocking her mannerisms. Then came the comment about the old bag and using my money for their condo down payment. The rest, you already know how I set down my plate, took the microphone, and exposed their deception to the entire party. What you don't know is what happened afterward, in those frozen seconds after I mentioned the $42,500 and implied I knew about their other plans for my money. The silence was absolute. Even the jazz quartet stopped playing, the last note hanging awkwardly in the air. Jason's face had drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Amber's friends slowly backed away from her, creating a visible circle of space around her that might have been comical under different circumstances. Margaret had risen from her seat, one hand pressed to her mouth, and Amber's expression shifted from shock to fury in the space of a heartbeat. She stalked toward the stage, silver dress shimmering under the lights. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, loud enough for the closest guests to hear. I held the microphone away from my mouth. I could ask you the same thing, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Using my retirement to fund your lifestyle. Lying to all these people about who's paying for what? Jason had appeared beside Amber, his face ashen. Aunt Eleanor, please, he begged quietly. Let's talk about this privately. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the confident young man who had helped me through my grief, but someone diminished, someone afraid. In that moment, my anger gave way to sadness. No, Jason, I said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. We've had 5 years of privately, 5 years, and $86,300. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Amber's face contorted. You're ruining everything, she spat. This is our night. I felt oddly calm as I replied, a night paid for with my money, which you apparently planned to steal more of for a condo down payment. Her eyes widened. Jason turned to her slowly. What is she talking about, Amber? What condo down payment? So he didn't know. That single revelation changed everything. Tell him, I said. Tell him what you were laughing about with your friends. About using the old bags. Money for your condo. Amber's face flushed red. She's lying. She's jealous of us, of our happiness. She's always trying to control you, to keep you dependent on her. The desperation in her voice was palpable. Several guests began quietly moving toward the exit. Jason looked between us, confusion evident on his face. Then Margaret stepped forward. I heard it too, Jason, she said quietly. I was getting napkins. She didn't see me. Amber's eyes darted wildly between us. This is insane. You two old women are ganging up on me because you can't stand that Jason has a life separate from you. Jason placed a hand on her arm. Amber, please. Just tell me what they're talking about. She shook him off violently. There's nothing to tell. They're confused. They're making things up. But her protest sounded hollow, even to my ears. A tall man, in an expensive suit, Amber's boss, I would later learn, cleared his throat. Actually, he said, I heard it too. The blood drained from Amber's face. Brad, don't, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. You specifically said you were using her money for the down payment on the condo. Your exact words. The room seemed to tilt again, but this time it was Amber who looked unsteady. Jason, she began, reaching for him. He stepped back, out of her reach. Is it true? He asked, his voice barely audible. When she didn't immediately deny it, his expression hardened. How much of Aunt Eleanor's money have you taken? How much have we taken? The distinction, his separation of you and we, wasn't lost on anyone. Amber's face twisted with anger. Don't act like you didn't benefit. Don't act like you didn't know. Those weekend trips. Your Rolex. The new car, where did you think the money was coming from? Your pathetic salary. Her words struck like physical blows. Jason flinched with each one. I thought, you said you had a trust fund, he said weakly. You said your investments were paying off. Amber laughed, a harsh sound, devoid of humor. My only investment was you, and your gullible aunt. God, you're both so stupid. The cruelty of her words hung in the air. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated. Instead, I felt only a profound sadness watching my almost son's world collapse around him. I stepped down from the small stage, still clutching the microphone. Jason, I said gently, I think it's time for some honesty. All the way around I turned to address the room. I apologize to all of you for this disruption. Please enjoy the rest of your evening. The food and drinks are paid for. Then I walked toward the exit, my back straight, my head high. I could feel eyes on me, hear the murmurs spreading through the crowd. Margaret fell into step beside me, slipping her arm through mine. Let's go home, she whispered. I nodded, emotionally exhausted. At the door, I paused, turning back to look at Jason one last time. Our eyes met across the room. His were filled with shame, confusion, and something else, a spark of the old determination I remembered from when we first met. It gave me a flicker of hope that somewhere under the man Amber had shaped, the real Jason still existed. We were almost to Margaret's car when I heard rapid footsteps behind us. Aunt Eleanor. Wait, Jason's voice, breathless. I turned to find him running toward us, tie askew, hair rumpled as if he'd been running his hands through it. Please, he said, coming to a stop before us. Please don't go. Not like this. I looked at him steadily. What do you want me to say, Jason? That it's okay? that I don't mind being used as your personal bank account for 5 years, because I do mind. I mind very much." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "About the condo money, about how much we've taken. I mean, I knew about the loans, but Amber always said we'd pay you back when her trust fund matured. I believed her." The vulnerability in his face reminded me of the young man who'd helped me through Frank's paperwork all those years ago. "How could you not know?" I asked, gentler than I intended. "The money had to come from somewhere." Jason's shoulders slumped. "I didn't want to know," he admitted. It was easier to believe her stories than to face the reality that we were living beyond our means, that I wasn't providing the lifestyle she wanted. He ran a hand through his hair again. "When she suggested asking you for help with the wedding, it seemed reasonable, a one-time thing. Then it became the down payment on the apartment. Then the car repairs. Each time, I told myself it was the last time." His voice cracked. "I was weak. I let her convince me it was okay because you had plenty of money and no other family to spend it on." The brutal honesty of his words stung, but I appreciated it more than any pretty lie. "Do you know how much is left of my retirement savings, Jason?" I asked quietly. "After tonight, barely $67,000, that's it. Everything Frank provided for me, nearly gone." The horror that spread across his face told me he truly hadn't known. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Aunt Eleanor, I had no idea. Amber said you had over $1 million, but these were just small withdrawals from the interest." He looked physically ill. Margaret, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "What are you going to do, Jason?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, just practical, pure. "Margaret." He straightened his shoulders slightly. "First, I'm going back in there to tell everyone the party's over. Then I'm going to figure out exactly how much money we've taken and start paying it back. Every penny." He hesitated. "And I think Amber and I need to have a serious conversation about our future." The uncertainty in his voice revealed how much he still loved her, despite everything. I felt a surge of sympathy. Love can blind us to so many things. Hadn't I ignored the signs about Amber for years because I loved Jason? Whatever. "You decide about Amber," I said, reaching out to straighten his tie. "I hope you'll decide to be honest with yourself from now on. That's more important than any money." He caught my hand, holding it against his chest. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "Can you ever forgive me?" I felt tears threatening. "I already have," I told him. "But forgiveness doesn't mean continuing as we were. Things have to change. Jason." He nodded solemnly. "They will, starting tonight." He hesitated, then added, "Will you come back inside? I don't want to end things like this. At least stay for the cake cutting, please." Margaret and I exchanged glances. "We'll come back for a little while," I agreed. "But then we're going home." As we walked back toward the Meridian, Jason kept pace beside me. "I need to tell you something else," he said quietly. "I found a new job, a better one, starting next month. I was going to surprise you." He trailed off, realizing how hollow that sounded now. "I'll use the extra income to start paying you back," he amended. I didn't respond. Promises were easy to make in moments of crisis. Actions would tell the real story in the days and weeks to come. Still, I felt a cautious optimism as we re-entered the building. The music had stopped. Small clusters of guests stood talking in hushed tones. Amber was nowhere to be seen. "She left," said a young woman I recognized as one of Amber's bridesmaids from the wedding. "Took a cab. She was pretty upset." The understatement hung awkwardly in the air. Jason nodded. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice stronger than I expected. "I want to apologize for the disruption earlier. The party is ending early tonight. Please feel free to take some cake and centerpieces home with you." There were murmurs of disappointment, but no real surprise. The mood had been irreparably damaged. As guests began collecting their things, Jason turned to me. "Come with me," he said, guiding me toward a small side room. Margaret followed. Inside, a hotel employee was arranging slices of the elaborate anniversary cake on small plates. "3 pieces, please," Jason requested. When we each had cake and were seated at the small table, he took a deep breath. "I need to tell you both something, and I need you to just listen until I'm finished." He looked directly at me. "Aunt Eleanor, over the past 5 years, I've asked you for money 27 times. The total amount, according to my records, is $89,800. The figure was even higher than my calculations. I felt my stomach clench, but remained silent as promised. I've been keeping track, Jason continued, even though I pretended not to. Even though I let Amber handle our finances and tell me what to believe. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then slid it across the table to me. I just transferred $12,500 back to your account. It's the money I've been secretly saving for the past year. It's not nearly enough, but it's a start. I stared at the phone screen, at the confirmation of the transfer. Jason, I began, but he held up a hand. I'm not finished. I've been hiding something else from both of you. From Amber too. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document. This is my new employment contract. I've been interviewing for months. The salary is double what I make now. Every month, half of the increase will go directly to a special account I've set up for repaying Aunt Eleanor. It will take years, but I will pay back every cent. I felt tears threatening again. Jason, you don't have to, he cut me off firmly. Yes, I do. This isn't just about money. It's about integrity. About becoming someone I can respect again when I look in the mirror. He turned to Margaret. And I owe you an apology to Aunt Margaret. For letting Amber treat you disrespectfully. For not standing up for you when she mocked your accent or your crafts or your ideas. That was cowardly of me. Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. You knew about that. Jason nodded, shame evident in his expression. I convinced myself she was just joking, that it wasn't serious. But deep down, I knew it was wrong. He pushed his cake away, untouched. I've been living in a fog for 5 years, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Tonight, his voice broke slightly. Tonight woke me up, and as painful as this is, I'm grateful for it. We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing his words. Then, Margaret reached across the table and patted his hand. People make mistakes, Jason. Even big ones. What matters is what you do next. Her simple wisdom, as always, cut straight to the heart of things. Jason gave her a grateful look. I know what I need to do. It starts with taking responsibility. And it might mean ending my marriage. The last words were barely audible, heavy with the weight of their implication. I felt a complex mix of emotion, sadness for his pain, relief that he was finally seeing clearly, worry about his future. Whatever happens with Amber, I said carefully, remember that true love doesn't diminish you. Frank and I had our disagreements, but we always built each other up, never tore each other down. Jason nodded slowly. I've been wondering lately what love actually is. Because what Amber and I have it doesn't feel like what you and Uncle Frank had. It doesn't even feel like what we had 5 years ago. The conversation was interrupted by the event coordinator, Valerie, poking her head into the room. Mr. Matthews, most of the guests have left. Should we begin cleanup? Jason stood. Yes, thank you, Valerie. And I apologize for the dramatic ending to the evening. She gave him a sympathetic smile. Trust me, sir, this isn't the first party that's ended with revelations. At least no one threw cake. Her attempt at humor earned a small smile from Jason. After she left, he turned back to us. I should stay and help with cleanup, would you? Like me to call you a car? I stood, smoothing my dress. No need. Margaret drove us. I hesitated, then opened my clutch and removed the check I'd written earlier. I was going to give you this tonight. $15,000 as a final gift. Jason's eyes widened as I tore the check in half, then in quarters. Instead, I continued, I'm giving you something more valuable, the truth about yourself, about Amber, about money, and the chance to make things right. I dropped the torn pieces into his hand. Use it wisely. The drive home with Margaret was quiet at first, both of us processing the evening's events. Finally, she broke the silence. Well, that was unexpected. The understatement made me laugh despite everything. Not exactly how I planned to handle things, I admitted. I never meant to cause a scene. Margaret snorted. Please, that scene was years in the making. You just happened to be the one who finally said what needed saying. She glanced at me as she stopped at a red light. Are you okay? Really? I considered the question carefully. I'm sad, I said finally. Sad about the money, yes, but more sad about the years of dishonesty. About watching Jason become someone he's not. About my own willingness to ignore what was happening. The light changed, and Margaret accelerated smoothly. But I'm also relieved. Like I've been carrying this heavy secret, and now it's out in the open. Now we can deal with it honestly. Margaret nodded. And what about your financial situation? David set up that trust, right? I confirmed that he had. Most of what's left is protected now. I'll be okay as long as I'm careful. The house is paid for, and my expenses are modest. I gazed out the window at the passing streetlights. Frank would be disappointed in how I handled things, but I think he'd be proud of me for finally standing up for myself tonight. Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand. Frank would understand. Ellie, love makes us do foolish things sometimes. He wasn't immune to that himself. She was right. Frank had his own blind spots where people he cared about were concerned. It was one of the things I'd loved about him, his willingness to see the best in others, even when they didn't deserve it. A quality I'd apparently inherited or learned from our years together. When we reached my house, Margaret insisted on coming inside. I'm making you tea, and we're going to sit and decompress before I leave you alone. I didn't argue. The thought of entering my empty house after such an emotional evening was daunting. While Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, I went to my bedroom to change out of my party clothes. As I hung up the navy blue dress, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with unshed tears, pearl necklace gleaming against my skin. I looked different somehow. Stronger maybe. More like the Eleanor that Frank had loved, the woman who stood her ground when it mattered, who didn't let fear of loneliness drive her decisions. I changed into comfortable clothes and joined Margaret in the kitchen, where she had prepared 2 mugs of chamomile tea and arranged cookies on a plate. Comfort food, she explained, pushing the cookies toward me. Sugar helps with emotional shock. I smiled. Taking a cookie, is that scientifically proven? She shrugged. It's the Margaret Reynolds theory of crisis management. Never failed me yet. We sat at my kitchen table, sipping tea and occasionally sharing observations about the evening. Did you see Brad's face when he confirmed hearing Amber? Margaret asked, like he'd been waiting years to take her down a notch. I nodded. I wonder how many other people have seen through her act before tonight. We weren't being mean-spirited, just processing, trying to understand how we'd all been deceived for so long. Around midnight, Margaret stood to leave. You'll call me tomorrow, she asked, collecting her purse. First thing, I promised. At the door, she hugged me tightly. I'm proud of you, Ellie. It took courage to do what you did tonight. After she left, I locked the door and leaned against it, exhaustion suddenly washing over me. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence heavier. I made my way back to the kitchen, intending to clean up, when my phone rang. It was after midnight. Who would be calling? Jason's name flashed on the screen. With a mixture of trepidation and hope, I answered. Hello. His voice came through clearly, though I could tell he'd been crying. Aunt Eleanor, can I come over? I need to talk to someone. I can't go home right now. 20 minutes later, Jason sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, looking utterly defeated. He'd changed out of his suit into jeans and a sweatshirt that made him look younger, more vulnerable. Amber's moving out, he said without preamble. She says she's done with my pathetic family and my mediocre ambitions. He stared into his coffee. She admitted everything, the lies about her trust fund, about our finances. She's been using the money from you for shopping, for weekend trips with her friends when I thought she was at business conferences. His voice cracked, she even has a separate bank account I didn't know about, with almost $30,000 in it. I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. I'm so sorry, Jason, and I was. Despite everything I knew he loved. Her first heartbreaks are devastating at any age. What happens now? I asked gently. He shook his head slowly. I don't know. Divorce, obviously. I've already called a lawyer friend for a recommendation. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. But first, I need to make things right with you. The transfer I showed you tonight was just the beginning. I've worked out a payment plan. He slid a folded paper across the table. I opened it to find a detailed spreadsheet, monthly payment, amounts, interest calculations, timeline. The final payment was scheduled for 7 years from now. Jason, I began, but he interrupted. Please, Aunt Eleanor, I need to do this. For myself as much as for you. The determination in his voice reminded me of Frank. Besides, he added with a ghost of his old smile, I've already set up the automatic transfers. The first one goes through on Monday. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions: pride in his commitment to making amends, sadness that it had come to this, hope for his future. "Where will you stay tonight?" I asked, noticing the small duffel bag he'd brought with him. "I got a hotel room," he said, "just for a few days until I figured things out." I hesitated, then offered, "You could stay here. The guest room is always ready." He looked surprised, then grateful. "Are you sure? After everything?" I considered my answer carefully. "Jason, what happened with the money that was wrong? And it needs to be made right. But you were there for me during the darkest time of my life. You helped me when I could barely get out of bed some days. That matters too." I squeezed his hand. "Besides, Frank always said people deserve second chances, just not third and fourth ones." That earned a genuine, if watery, smile. "Thank you," he said simply. "I promise I won't let you down again." I nodded, hoping he meant it, but knowing that only time would tell. Jason stayed in my guest room for 2 weeks before finding a small apartment closer to his new job. During that time, I witnessed his transformation, painful but necessary, from the man Amber had shaped back into something closer to his true self. He called his new employer and explained that he needed to start immediately rather than waiting until the following month. He met with a divorce attorney and initiated proceedings, discovering in the process that Amber had opened credit cards in his name that he knew nothing about. He spent evenings going through their financial records, cataloging every debt, every lie. Some nights I heard him crying quietly in the guest room. I never mentioned it, knowing he needed to grieve in private. What surprised me most was his determination to take responsibility for his role in the deception. I could have asked questions, he told me one evening as we shared dinner. I could have insisted on seeing the accounts myself instead of letting Amber handle everything. I wanted to believe we could afford our lifestyle, because it made me feel successful, important. The first payment appeared in my account exactly when Jason promised it would, and the second, and the third, each month, without fail, for the next 3 years. Sometimes it was difficult for him, I know. There were months when he ate ramen noodles for dinner to make the payment, but he never complained, never asked to skip a month or reduce the amount. His divorce from Amber was finalized for months after the anniversary party. She fought it initially, then seemed to lose interest when she realized there were no significant assets to divide, just debt. The last I heard, she'd moved to California with a new boyfriend, someone with actual money, according to the mutual friends who occasionally updated Jason. He seemed relieved rather than heartbroken by the news. "I hope she finds whatever she's looking for," was all he said. "I'm just glad it's not my problem anymore." Over time, our relationship healed and evolved. Jason continued, coming to Sunday dinners, now often bringing interesting books or articles to discuss, rather than financial requests. He developed a genuine friendship with Margaret, even helping her set up an online shop to sell her handcrafted items. He got promoted at his new job, then promoted again. 3 years after the anniversary party disaster, he was dating a kind, down-to-earth woman named Rachel who worked as a pediatric nurse and looked at him with genuine affection, not calculation. The first time he brought her to Sunday dinner, I watched them carefully, looking for signs of the unhealthy dynamic he'd had with Amber. Instead, I saw mutual respect, shared laughter, the easy companionship of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's presence. When Rachel insisted on helping with the dishes, refusing to take no for an answer, I found myself blinking back unexpected tears. This was what I'd always wanted for him. As for me, those 3 years brought changes of my own. With David Goldstein's help, I restructured my remaining savings, making careful investments that would stretch my retirement funds as long as possible. I sold some of Frank's collectibles that had been gathering dust in the attic, adding another $23,000 to my accounts. I started volunteering at the local library 2 days a week, finding unexpected joy in helping elderly patrons navigate computers and young parents find the perfect picture books for their children. Margaret and I joined a travel club for seniors, taking modestly priced bus tours to nearby states, nothing extravagant, but enough to satisfy my long-dormant wanderlust. Life settled into a new rhythm, different from what I'd planned, but satisfying in its own way. The financial anxiety that had plagued me since realizing how much I'd given away gradually eased, replaced by a cautious optimism about my future. Looking back now, 5 years after that fateful anniversary party, I can see the event for what it was. A painful but necessary awakening for all of us. The scene I caused was humiliating in the moment, but it forced truths into the open that had been festering in darkness for too long. Jason has repaid almost $62,000 of what he borrowed, faithfully sticking to his payment plan, even after his recent wedding to Rachel, a modest affair they paid for themselves. When I suggested he might reduce the monthly amount to save for a house, he refused. A debt is a debt, he said simply. Besides, we're doing fine. And they are. Their apartment is small but comfortable, their lifestyle modest but happy. When they announced they were expecting a baby due next spring, they showed me their detailed budget for childcare costs, healthcare, education, savings, no magical thinking, no unrealistic expectations, just careful planning and mutual decisions. Last Sunday, as we sat around my dining table enjoying Margaret's famous apple pie, Jason raised his water glass in a toast. To Aunt Eleanor, he said, his expression serious, who had the courage to tell the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. Margaret and Rachel lifted their glasses, echoing the sentiment. I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. I didn't feel very courageous at the time, I admitted, just angry and hurt. Jason shook his head. It takes courage to risk losing someone you love by telling them an uncomfortable truth. He glanced at Rachel, who squeezed his hand encouragingly. And I have something to tell you, something I've been working on. He reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope, sliding it across the table to me. Inside was a cashier's check for $24,800, the remaining balance of his debt. My company gave me a significant bonus last month, he explained. Rachel and I decided this was the best use for it. I stared at the check, emotions welling up. Jason, you don't need to do this. You have a baby coming, a family to provide for. He reached across the table, taking my hand. That's exactly why I need to do this. I want my child to know their father is a man of integrity. A man who keeps his promises and rights his wrongs. His voice was firm, his eyes clear and direct, so different from the uncertain young man who had let Amber lead him astray. Besides, he added with a smile, now I can start saving for your birthday present instead. The laughter that followed broke the emotional tension, and conversation shifted to baby names and nursery colors. But later, as I was seeing them to the door, Jason hung back while Rachel and Margaret discussed knitting patterns on the porch. There's something else I want you to know, he said quietly. Even if I've repaid the money, I can never repay the deeper debt your belief in me, even when I didn't deserve it. That's the real gift you gave me. So if you're listening to this and wondering what happened to change a spoiled, entitled daughter-in-law into a cautionary tale, the answer is simple. Truth, painful, inconvenient, necessary truth. Sometimes we need to be willing to create an uncomfortable scene to break through years of deception. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst behaviors. And sometimes we need to be reminded of our own worth, our own boundaries, before we give away everything trying to buy someone else's love or approval. If you recognize yourself in my story either as someone who's been taken advantage of, or as someone who's been looking the other way while it happens, know that it's never too late to change the narrative. The hardest conversations are often the most necessary ones, and true love, whether between partners, friends, or family, should leave you feeling valued, not depleted. Take it from someone who's been there. The momentary discomfort of confrontation is nothing compared to the freedom that comes with living in truth. If you've stuck with me through this whole story, thank you for listening. If you know someone who might benefit from hearing it, please share it with them. Maybe it will give them the courage to have their own difficult conversation. And if you're facing a similar situation right now, remember, you deserve more than to be someone's ATM or emotional doormat. Your worth isn't measured by how much you give or how much you endure. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply say, enough. I'm Eleanor Reynolds, recording this from my sunroom in Milwaukee, surrounded by Margaret's handmade quilts and the peace that comes from knowing exactly where I stand. Good night, and be brave.